All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Today's daf is Chav Gimel, and we are starting in Meretz Hashem at Chav Beis Amud Beis. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem at the three lines up from the bottom. First let me thank our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei. To thank Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all the Shurman Drushos this month in memory of their parents. To thank Jack Bennett for dedicating all the Shiurim in memory of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport. And to thank Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating all the Shurman Drushos this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg Peretz Moshe ben Avraham David. Our week of learning sponsors, Ira Miriam Grossman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Ira's father, Melvin Grossman. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in Chava. Good and mighty, say, let us begin. So we are picking up in Meretz Hashem, three lines up from the bottom. Three lines up from the bottom. Chaf Beis Amud Beis 22b. Okay, good. 22b. Iboilu Mo La'ashim. So we'll say the Gemara asks the question: what is the halacha concerning smoking? Now, smoking what? If you take a look at Rashi says over here, 5 lines up from the bottom, Ma'u la'ashim, asks Rashi, Peiros ba'ashan b'samim, liklot tam habosem. What's the halacha concerning smoking fruit? In order so you'll be smoking fruit over some type of aromatic spices, in order for the fruit to go ahead and absorb the... Oh, Ari, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. In order to go ahead and absorb the smell of the spices. So that's the shaila. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Aser, Shmuel Amar Motor. Rav says it's Aser, Shmuel says it's Motor. What's the nature of the machlokes? So if I look at Rashi, Aser, the tafnuk yiseruhu ve'in shava l'chol nefesh ela le'istinis ubahai ashan ika av malachas. Supposed to listen to this. What we're going to see is as follows. When it comes to the halach of ochel nefesh says you could do malacha, but as you pointed out on Yom Tiv, you could do malacha for what's considered to be a normative everyday need. So Rav will say that the concept of smoking fruit was something that was done for, very, hoity-toity type of people. Right? This was a delicacy. This wasn't considered to be a thing that was necessarily common for everyday folk. Because of that, you can't go ahead and do it on Yom Tiv. We'll see what the malachas involved are. So the Gemara says as follows. So ultimately, again, Rav Huna explains why would Rav hold that it's asur? Because there's an element of extinguishing. Because apparently, again, when you go ahead and you smoke the fruit on the besamim, on the spices, you end up inadvertently going ahead and extinguishing some of the spices. By the way, just to go back for just a second, Shmuel, who says that you can go ahead and smoke the fruit, he holds because halacha l'maisa it's ochel nefesh. So because it's ochel nefesh, therefore halacha l'maisa it's not a problem. Amrli Rav Nachman, b'nei mamar b'nei shamabir, isn't it also a problem of havara? In other words, that sometimes through the process of going ahead and smoking the fruit, you actually cause the kindling of the spices. There's a twofold problem. In the beginning, you could end up going ahead and causing kindling, and ultimately it could result in causing extinguishing. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda, Al-Gabi Gacheles Aser. Rabbi Yehuda says to go ahead and smoke the fruit on top of the coals, that's problematic. Why? Because then you'll end up potentially kindling and extinguishing. Top of Chav Gimel, Al Gabe Cheres Mutter. But to go ahead and smoke the fruit on a piece of earthenware, ultimately, again, that is going to be mutter. I will say now the case of the earthenware would be a piece of earthenware that you heated up. So let's say you heated up the earthenware, and you go and you have some absorbed aromatic spices inside of the earthenware, that's okay. Rava Amar Agabi Cheres Nami Aser. Rabba says, no, on Cheres it's also a problem. Why? Mishum de Kamolid Recha. Because ultimately, again, you are causing the creation of scent. Now, if you look at Rashi, second line down from Rashi, the Kamolid Recha, Shenichnas Becheres. In other words, say you're causing the creation of scent in what? In the piece of earthenware. So Rashi says, Shelo Hayabareach. Now we'll say, what's the problem of causing scent? Now we already alluded to this in yesterday's daf, where the Gemara made reference to the concept of perfuming garments. What's the problem with that? Right? Remember, we saw that even if you hold mugmar, that kindling incense is mutter on Yom Tiv, you cannot go ahead and cause aroma or scent. So you can't perfume your clothing. So what's the problem with that? What's the problem of perfuming things on Yom Tiv? So Rashi says over here, the Kamol Reicha shenichnas bechares shelo hayu boreach va'aser midrabanan shamolid davar chadash karufu la'ose milacha chadasha. Because this is very interesting. The concept of perfuming, of creating scent, it looks like malacha. It looks like malacha, right? Essentially, anytime you create something, it has the appearance of malacha. Now, again, is it asr min da'oraisa? No. But the concept of infusing scent or perfuming, of whether it's an article of clothing or a piece of earthenware, will ultimately be asr min dirabanan. The Gemara says, "Umayshna mimololo umariach bo." Why is this different than taking an herb and rolling it and smelling it? In other words, we'll say that sometimes you would take an herb, right, and you would go or a piece of incense, and you would roll it to unlock the scent, or v'kotmo umariach, or you snip off the top of it and you go ahead and you smell it. So we see. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Rabbi Rav Yosef. I'm sorry. Sechufe kasa ashirai biyomotava aser. Thank you. So Rabbi and Rav Yosef both said that halacha lemaisa. Going ahead, if you look at Rashi, sechufe kasa ashirai means lechapos kos mevusam ala shiraim shal mabush lahachnis bahan reach habosim shavakos. But this is interesting. This is taking a cup full of aromatic scent, right? Of aromatic scent, and going ahead and putting it on a silk article of clothing, once again, in order to perfume the article of clothing. So the Gemara says, you're not allowed to do this on Yom Tiv. My taima, mishum de kamolid reicha. Ultimately, again, because you're perfuming the garment. So we'll say, this is a concept that, I just want to point out, by the way, this is halacha l'maisa. I can tell you where this comes up. Let's say you were schwitzing, and your clothing got soaked with perspiration, but you want to wear it again. You can't spritz like deodorant or perfume on the article of clothing. You could put perfume or cologne or deodorant on you, but you cannot go ahead and perfume an article of clothing on Yom Tiv. This is this concept, mishum de kamolid reicha. What's the problem with it? Again, it's a dirabanan because it has the appearance ultimately again that you are creating something. Molid davar chadash. You are creating something new, and Rashi says again that has the appearance of malacha. Says the Gemara, why is this different than taking an aromatic spice and rolling it in order to go ahead and release the scent, or or snipping off the top of it and smelling it? To which the Gemara says a very big difference. Hasam reicham hiya isa vasuviha the kamosif reicha. Well, so in a case you're just taking the herb and rolling it or cutting off the tip, the scent is already there. What are you doing? You're unlocking it. Hacha alude hu de kamolid reicha. Both say in the case where you perfume an article of clothing, you are creating something that was not there before. Beforehand there was an unperfumed garment, and now it is a perfumed garment. Rava says, al gabe gacheles nami mutter. Rava says even to go ahead and, we're going back now to smoking fruit, right? To go ahead and smoke the fruit on Yom Tiv is going to be permitted, and you could do it even on top of coals. Now look at Rashi. Rashi's almost right across. Rava Amra Gabi Gachalas Nami Mutter Kishmuel the Ochel Nefeshu Ishon Peruzeh V'Shav L'Chol Nefesh. So we'll say ultimately again, Rava's of the opinion that the smoking of fruit is considered to be Shava L'Chol Nefesh. Now we'll say we're going to get into this, but it's actually very interesting to contemplate, because how do you define something that's normative? How do you define normative? So, for example, we'll see that there's interesting discussion the Gemara is going to have about there's the next parak about trapping a deer, right? You're allowed to shed down. Deer meat was considered to be a delicacy. So, can you go ahead and shech the deer on Yom Tiv? Is that called Shava L'Chol Nefesh? See, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is going to say, we're going to see is, yes, everybody would agree that consumption of deer is a normative pleasure. The fact that some people could afford it, some people can't afford it, doesn't make it non-normative. Rav is coming along and he's saying, listen, it could very well be that only certain people smoke fruit. That's possible. And maybe it's considered to be a bit more of a delicacy. But the fact that it's considered to be a delicacy doesn't take away from the fact that it's still normative. It's something that regular normative people would enjoy. So therefore, Rav says, halacha l'maisa, you could even go ahead and halacha l'maisa roast it on top of the coals. After all, midi dahavi abisra agmuri. Same way that you could roast meat on coals. For example, I'll say, everyone agrees you could roast meat on coals. Even though, when you roast meat on coals, what's inevitably happening? Havar and kibui. Right? You're going to end up extinguishing something, kindling something, but, as they say, that's the price of doing business, right? That's the price of ochal nefesh, and that's okay, because it's included under ochal nefesh. So the Gemara says, Darash Rav Gavia mi Ksil, apischa de Reish Kalusa. Rav Gavia from Ksil, darshan the following at the entranceway of the home of Reish Kalusa, Ketura Shari. Ketura is permitted. Excellent. What's ketura? My ketura. What is that? I ketura bidi my seumanhu. So we'll say it's interesting. Ketura bidi. Rashi says over here something very interesting. Sha'osin lebate shokayim ulebate yadayim shel chalukei noshim shemekamtin osan shai. So we'll say this was the act of pressing clothing. We actually did this a little bit in Smichas Chaver as well. If you're talking about actually like pressing clothing so that the pleats are stiff, you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tiv. And ultimately, again, if it's talking about if ketura means smoking, because katir in Aramaic is smoke. If ketura means the smoking of fruit or the smoking of food, then ultimately, again, this will be aser, because don't you run the risk, halacha l'maisa, of going ahead and extinguishing and kindling. Amir Rashi, the olam la'ashin. Really, it's talking about smoking fruit. But you're allowed to do it. Why? Midi dahavi abisra agmuri. Because ultimately, again, it's no different than cooking meat on the coals, which is going to be permitted. My ketura, what's ketura? Ketura bidi ma'aseumanhu. If it's the stiffening of the pleats, that's considered to be a craftsman's work, and therefore Allah l'maisa will be asr on Yom Tiv. Ila ashen asr, and if you're talking about, and if ultimately again it's perfuming clothing, that's problematic. To come recha, you are creating scent. Amravashi ana amrisin nehile mishmedi gavaraba amrisin nehile leolam laashen umidi dahavia bisragum. I'm sorry, not perfuming clothing. I'm sorry, smoking fruit. And ultimately, what does it refer to? It refers to smoking fruit. And why is it permitted? Because halacha l'maisa, it's no different ultimately than what? Than putting meat on the coals. So we'll say halacha, and I just want to point out that's how we paskin halacha l'maisa. So if you had smoked fruit on the menu for second day's Yom Tiv, you are in luck. You're good to go, right? Even though, again, most people, it appears, did not really eat this. And halacha l'maisa, again, this was considered to be more of a delicacy. Since it's ochal nafesh, it is food. We're going to see, even if something is only consumed by some. But if you would ask most people, is this a normative food? People would say, sure, I'd love to have, maybe most people would say, I'd love to have that, but it's out of my budget. It's out of my budget. Being out of my budget doesn't take away from the fact that it's normative ochal nafesh. So we'll say, would you begin to see something very interesting, that ochal nafesh becomes permitted, even if what? Even if it could result in a little bit of extinguishing and kindling. And a paradigmatic example of that is roasting meat on coals, where you see, I will say, I don't know, this is interesting, because normally I think when you think about like roasting meat on coals, I don't know, I always assumed that you have like a grate on top of the coals, but you see from the Gemara that they were roasting meat on the coals themselves, which by definition meant that there was some level of extinguishing and kindling, yet that was still permitted. Good, let's go weiter. Va'osin gedi makula. So we'll say one of the other interesting things in the Mishnah is Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel said you can make a gedi makulas on Erev Yom Tiv. You can make a gedi makulas on Erev Yom Tiv. So says the Gemara. Now, interestingly enough, in the Mishnah, so the Gemara says that the Chachamim disagreed that you cannot make a gedi makulas. So says the Gemara, listen to this. Now both say, what's the gedi makulas? The gedi makulas is the roasted kid, and you take the entrails, the kishkas of the animal, and you roast it along outside next to the animal. Says the Gemara Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer, Todus ish Romi hinig espene Romi le'achal gedei makulas. Todus of Rome, he introduced the minhag in Rome that they used to eat a gedei makulas. Now I will say, you're going to see what's unique about this. So in Rome, on the first night of Pesach, what was the menu? The menu was roasted sheep, right? Roasted goats. But how would they roast it? They would put the entire animal on a spit, and then they would take the kishkas of the animal, roast it outside of the animal next to the animal. This is what Todus introduced in Rome. Shol chulei, the rabbis sent to Todus, El moli Todusato, were it not for the fact that you are Todus, and Rashi says, Chacham gadol v'nichbad, you're a big Talmud Chacham and very well respected, Gozrani alecha nidui, we would put you in Cherem. Were it not that you're such a great man, we would put you in Cherem. Why? Sha'ata ma'achil as b'nei Yisrael kadshim b'chutz. Because you are giving Klal Yisrael karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Somewhere else we'll say, kadshim sa'k'netra, what? Was Todus shechting karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash? Of course not. Ella ema ke'ein kadshim. I will say, but rather what was happening over here? Todus was preparing a lamb exactly the same way it was prepared in the Beis HaMikdash, the Karban Pesach. And I will say, remember, we don't like that, right? We don't like that. We always try to avoid anything that has the appearance of being makdish kadshim b'chutz, of offering karbanos outside. So Todus was mamish going ahead and literally offering up a lamb preparing a lamb in the same way that it was prepared for Karban Pesach. And the rabbis were very upset, but Todus was a big Talmud Chacham. It seems to be also that he was nechba. Nechba means he was very well respected. I don't know, probably in the Jewish community, outside the Jewish community. So the Maisa, they felt that they couldn't take action against him, but they voiced their displeasure. We'll say, we know this halacha very well, because the minhag Yisrael is, we don't eat roasted meat. Right? Forget about a lamb. We don't eat roasted meat on the night of Pesach, right? And there's a whole discussion in the posting exactly how far you have to take this, but it's a very, very, very strong minhag. On the Seder plate, when we go ahead and get to Rabbi Gamliel Haya Omer, Kol Shalo Amar Shlosha Dvarim Elu BaPesach Lo Yatzei De Chavaso, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, we point to the matzah, we point to the maror, we dafka what? Don't point to the Pesach, which is an incredible thing, right? As if to think like anyone's going to have a havamina, that shank bone on your Seder plate, that's the Karban Pesach, but you see how careful we are not to be makdish kadshim b'chutz. So I'll tell you something interesting on this, because it's fascinating to me. There are so many things that we do zecher l'mikdash. Right? For example, we take lulav all 7 days. Zecher l'mikdash. So you see this incredible dialectic that on one hand, we engage in so many practices in order to go ahead and keep the Beis HaMikdash alive, but yet, in this area, when it comes to meat, we are so careful never to go ahead and do anything that looks like a karban. By Yomim Noran, when we bow down, even if you have carpeting, right? The halacha is, the minhag is, you still put something under you, because we don't bow down on a bare floor outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So, what's the pshat? Why is it sometimes I'm trying to recreate the mikdash, sometimes I don't want to be the mikdash? So, I think it's an incredible yisod. You see, what Chazal were trying to do was to awaken within us a yearning without creating a complacency. You see, if you could have essentially sacrificial meat, and if you could end up doing everything like the mikdash, what ends up happening? Who needs it? Right? We've got everything that we need. So there's this incredible balance between, on one hand, going ahead and replicating certain practices in order to go ahead and keep the Beis HaMikdash alive in our consciousness, while at the same time not becoming complacent. Isn't this see the danger in life when you lose something, right? You see sometimes, again, this happens. A person is learning in yeshiva, and then they leave yeshiva, and in that first little bit when they leave yeshiva, there's like an ache. There's an ache. What it was like to be, learn what it was like to this. And then what happens to the ache over time? What happens to the ache over time? It goes away. It goes away. And you settle for your new reality. You come off the Yamim Noraim, and a person's on a high, and I want more Kedusha, and I want more godless, and I want more growth. And then what happens? And you kind of settle back in, Chas v'shalom, to the regular rhythms of life. So in a mikdash also, Chazal want us to yearn, they want us to yearn, but if you could have everything, then there's nothing to yearn for anymore. So Chazal put in our lives just enough to give us a taste. That taste is so beautiful. That taste is so wonderful, but it's not too much. It's not too much of a taste so that I can have everything I want. So why do I need the mikdash? It's just enough of a taste to awaken within me an incredibly intense yearning for what was and Emir Hashem what will be. What's a Mishnah? Shlosha Dvarim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvaro. Says the Mishnah, Shlosha Dvarim Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Matiracham Mosrim. It's an interesting case. 3 things Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah permitted and the Chachamim asert. What were the 3 things? Number 1, Parasa Yotze Beretzua. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow used to go out with its strap. Rabbi say, interestingly enough, the cow would go out with a strap that was tied between its horns. If you look at Rashi, so we're talking about on Shabbos. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's animal would go out on Shabbos with the strap between its horns. Rashi says over here, Lenoi, va'amra banan masayu ve'ena takshitla. Rabbi said, this is back to Gemara Shabbos. So the Gemara says that ultimately, again, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah would allow his animal to go out because he felt that the ribbon was decorative. And therefore I like to status of like a malbush, an article of clothing. The Chacham disagreed with him. Okay. They would comb the animal on Yom Tov. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah would allow his animal to be combed on Yom Tov. Now Rashi points out, by the way, Mekadrin is talking about with a metal comb with very fine teeth. Now what's the chap of combing your animal with a metal comb and fine teeth? It causes bleeding. It creates a chabura. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah allowed this to comb the animal on Yom Tiv. V'shochakin es apalpul in berechaim shalahem. Furthermore, again, you could crush peppers, right, or peppercorns in their grinder. Rabbi Yehuda Omer im raktin es habehema b'Yom Tiv b'nei she'osa chabura. Rabbi Yehuda says no. In mekardin, you cannot go ahead and comb an animal with a metal comb on Yom Tiv. Ultimately, because you make a chabura, you end up causing the animal to bleed. Aval mekartzefin. Now, what can you do? Mekartzefin. I will say mekartzefin is also combing the animal. But combing the animal with what? With a wooden comb with thicker teeth. So this, I guess, will extract from the mane of the animal, whatever you're trying to extract. But halacha l'maisa doesn't cause the animal to bleed. The chum say, ein mekardin velo mekartzefin. You can't comb at all. Can't comb with a metal comb. You can't comb with a wooden comb. You just can't do it. Rash says the Gemara the Memra. This is great. The Mishnah makes it sound like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah allowed his cow to go out with a ribbon between its horns. It sounds like how many cows did Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah have? 1. The Gemara says what? Amar Rav, both said, listen to this. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Tleisar alfei agle have hava masar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah me'adrak kol shasa v'shasa. Both say, get ready for this. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah separated 13,000 cows from his flock as meiser behema every single year. 13,000 cows from his flock. We'll say, isn't that absolutely incredible? Right? So and now, again, could that be a little bit hyperbolic? It could be hyperbolic, but what's the point? What's the point the Gemara is making? He was incredibly wealthy, right? It wasn't one, right? That's the thing. It wasn't one. He was incredible. I just want to point out, by the way, we'll say something really incredible if you notice, by the way, remember again, the famous Ma'aser Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Maseches Brachos, right? After they deposed Rabbi Gamliel as being the Rosh Yeshiva, they approach Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, right? And this is the Harei Anika ben Shivim Shana. He was only 18 years old when he was appointed Rosh Yeshiva. You remember again, he asks his wife if he should take the job or not, right? And she says to him, no, are you crazy? She says, remember, any job you walk into in life, always look what happened to your predecessor. What happened to the guy before you in the job? How did they treat him? How did they take care of him? So she said, they deposed Rabbi Gamliel. They deposed him. They fired Rabbi Gamliel. It's pretty wild if you think about it. They fired Rabbi Gamliel. So if they fired Rabbi Gamliel, who's smarter than you and older than you, no offense, honey, right? Smarter than you and older than you, right? Then at the end, what are they going to do to you? So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah has a whole shita about this, going into, you take advantage of the opportunities in life. But I also think it's very interesting as follows. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was independently wealthy. And there is something, bless you, there is something to taking on positions of community, of leadership, when you are independently wealthy. Why? Because at the end of the day, you don't depend on anyone else for your parnasa, right? And when you're financially independent, that allows you to do certain things and allows you to have a certain level of standing that you don't have to be, quote unquote, afraid of community power. So I've often thought that might have also been what gave Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah kind of the strength to accept the position, because there was no level of financial intimidation that could be used against him. He was independent, so it didn't work out. It didn't work out, which is an incredible yisur. In any event, the point the Gemara is making over here is that halacha l'maisa, he had much more than one cow. To which the Gemara says, Tana lo shalo. This is crazy. Not crazy. This is incredible. Tana lo shalo haisa. You're right. It wasn't his cow. It wasn't his cow. The Mishnah is not referring to his cow. Ella shal shcheinoso haisa. It was his neighbor's cow. Umitoch shalom micha ba nikreis al shmo. And since he did not go ahead and object to this practice of the cow wearing the ribbon out on Yom Tiv, ultimately, again, it was called his cow. So I will say, the fact that the neighbor's cow went out like this, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah didn't say anything, halacha l'maisa tells you that, makes it that what? It was his cow. I will say, an incredible musr also, that, we are responsible for what happens beyond our Daled Amos also. When things happen within our purview, right? When things are going on around us, you can't necessarily intervene or shape the circumstances that are going around all around you. But Lamaisa, there is some level of responsibility for the circumstances happening by your neighbors also. That if you person sees something wrong in general, when you see something wrong in life, when do I go ahead and say not my business versus when do I go ahead and get involved to try to right a wrong is a very delicate dance. But Lamaisa, at least Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, when he saw his neighbor doing something, had he objected to this practice, he should have objected. The fact that he didn't object ultimately made it, Mishnah treats it like his cow. It's interesting enough, so says, therefore, it sounds like from the Gemara over here that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah himself may actually not have permitted this practice. But the fact that his neighbor did it and he didn't say anything created a situation where he was giving his blessing to this particular practice. So remember again, the next piece was, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, you can comb the animal on Yom Tiv. Now again, remember, combing the animal in this context means with a metal comb with fine teeth. Tan Rabbanan, so the Gemara says it. Eizuhu karod ve'ezu kirtzuf. What's kard? What's kirtzuf? Karod kitanim va'osin chabura. Karod is a metal comb with fine teeth that makes a chabura on the animal. Kirtzuf, what's kirtzuf? Gedolim ve'enos in chabura. Ultimately, again, it's a wooden comb, large teeth, and doesn't create a chabura. The gimel machlokos bedavar. The Gemara says, in fact, this is a three-way machlokos. What's the three-way machlokos? Here we go. Rabbi Huda Sava. Rabbi Huda says, remember again, Rabbi Huda says that you could use the wood large tooth comb, but not the metal small tooth comb. So watch this. Rabbi Huda Savar, Davar Shenim Miskavein Aser. Rabbi Huda holds that Davar Shenim Miskavein, because we're supposed to remember again, when you go, remember, you don't want to cause the animal to bleed, right? When you go ahead and you use that metal comb, it's not your intention to cause bleeding in the animal, so it's a Davar Shenim Miskavein, an unintended consequence. Rabbi Huda holds, Davar Shenim Miskavein is Aser. Mihu, Karud kitanin va'osin chabura. I'm sorry. Davar she'eino miskavin aser. Miu karud kitanin va'osin chabura. Kirtzuf gidolim ve'eino osin chabura. V'lo gazrinon kirtzuf atu karud. So we'll say Rabbi Huda holds like this. Rabbi Huda holds Davar she'eino miskavin is aser, and therefore you can't use a fine tooth metal comb on Yom Tiv, but you can use a large tooth wooden comb, and we're not afraid that if we let you use the large tooth wooden comb, that's what? You're going to come to use the fine tooth metal comb. But Rabbanan and Sabri, Rabbi Yehuda Davar she'eino miskavin aser, the Rabbanan agree that a Davar she'eino miskavin is aser, but they take this one step further. V'gazrinon kirtzuf atu karud. But they hold that we won't let you use a wooden comb, lest you what? Come to use a metal comb. Okay, so we'll say that's Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. For Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, first white line of the bottom, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Savla Reb Shimon. Oh, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds like Reb Shimon. What does Reb Shimon hold? Damar Dever She'eino miskavin mutter. Oh, he holds the Davar she'eino miskavin, right? When you do something that has an unintended consequence, that is mutter on Shabbos, and therefore ben karot or ben kirtzov shari. You would therefore Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says metal comb, wooden comb, it's all mutter, because even if you cause bleeding, it's called what? A davar she'eino miskavin, an unintended consequence, an unintended circumstance, and therefore halacha l'maisa it's mutter. So we'll say three-way machlokes: Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehuda, and the Rabbanon. Amar Rav, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, Amar Rav Nachman l'chudei halacha k'Rabbi Shimon. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, namely that a davar she'eino miskavin on Shabbos is mutter. Shari Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah modelo. How do we know that halacha is Rabbi Shimon? Because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah paskins like him. Both say that a davar she'eino miskavin is going to be mutter on Shabbos. Amar lei Rav Rav Nachman v'lei mamar halacha k'Rabbi Yehuda shari chachamim modim lo. I don't understand, but why don't you say the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda that a davar she'eino miskavin is aser? Because after all, the chachamim line up with Rabbi Yehuda. Amrali Anak Rabbi Shimon Sirle. He says, because first of all, I also hold like Rabbi Shimon. Right? I hold like Rabbi Shimon also. So because I like Rabbi Shimon, therefore Allah nice again, I like to go with the Ibn like Rabbi Shimon. Furthermore, Va'od Shar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Mod. And also we know halacha l'maisa, that is how we paskin Hilchos Shabbos, that a davar she'eino miskavin is mutter. Now again, there still may be where we get into the interesting discussion, is a davar she'eino miskavin is mutter. Where do you get into an issue? Remember, where do you get into an issue? Psik Reisha, excellent. By Psik Reisha, sub-Psik Reisha, Denechale, Psik, excellent. So that's where you get now. It's interesting, the Gemara doesn't bring that up over here, which would seem to mean that even with the use of the metal comb, it's not a Psik Reisha. That's what it sounds like, that the Gemara doesn't bring it up. There may be a high probability of causing bleeding in the animal, but Lamaisa, it's not a definitive consequence. Incredible. So we'll say that's the end of the Sugya Amud Beis. Mishnah. We'll say, we're going to finish the part. What does first day Chalamite get to finish the Perek in Gemara? Absolutely incredible. Mishnah. Harechayim shal pilpulin. A pepper grinder. Says the Gemara, Tmeya mishum shlosha kelim. So we're going to see that the grinders that were used for peppers were made of three parts. And interestingly enough, each one of those three parts had the ability to be mekabel tuma, because each part had its own identity. So, for example, there was a receptacle, there was a metal utensil, there was a sieve. So we'll say all the Gemara is saying is it was made of three parts. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes if you have a multi-part utensil, when the utensil is in pieces, it may not be makabel toma because it may not have the identity as a complete kli when it's in pieces. What the Mishnah is introducing over here is that halacha l'maisa, each part of the pepper grinder has its own identity, which means even if it's disassembled, halacha l'maisa, each part has the ability to be mekabel tuma. So if you look at Rashi says mekabelas tuma al shem shlosha kelim. Nafkamina dinami azul chad shma mina tmeya mishum idach. So listen to this. Here we go. So Tana tachtonu mishum klei kibel. The bottom utensil, right? The bottom part of the grinder was the receptacle. So that could become tamei ultimately again as a base kibel. Emtsoes mishum kli kavra. The middle one was the sieve part. and that could become tameh because it's a sieve. And the upper part, ultimately, again, is just a stam metal utensil, and therefore it can become tameh. Both say an incredible yisod in this well. What do you see from the pepper? So there's a muster in everything, including pepper grinders. What do you see? The power of pepper grinder. The grinder has an identity when all the pieces are together, but the grinder also has an identity when the pieces are separate. Isn't that an incredible metaphor for the Jew? There are two identities that I exist with. I exist with the identity as a member of Klal Yisrael. I have an identity as a member of the collective, but my goal is also to create an identity at the end of the day, how? As an individual. I am a pepper grinder, right? I have a part of my identity when I'm part of the whole, because I will say that is so incredible. This is why you have the concept of al tifrosh minat tzibur. Don't separate yourself from the cloud. Don't separate yourself from the community. Don't separate yourself from the tzibur, because there's a power, there's a piece of my identity that by definition comes from being part of the collective. But I can't just be part of the collective. I have to cultivate an individualistic identity as well. Rav Shamshon Nafal Hirsch brings down, he says, you begin Shmona Esrei with the bracha of Avos, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. Even though every single Jew davens the same words of Shmona Esrei, we begin with the Avos. Why? Because Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov could not have been three more different people. They were each unique and each different. So we all daven the same words in Shemona Esrei, but our relationships with HaKadosh Baruch Hu have to be so different. You have to be part of the whole, but you also have to go ahead and cultivate a meaningful individual identity. Incredible. Mishnah, Agala Shel Katan, another interesting case. Agala Shel Katan, we'll say, is a child's wagon. Rashi says, Agala Shel Katan, She'osna Lischok, V'yoshev Aleh, Metaltalin Osala. It says literally a wagon. Literally, what does the kid do with the wagon? He uses it to play, and ultimately he sits in it, and people could pull him in it. Mamish a wagon. So the agala, the wagon of a katan, is Tmeya Medris. Could become Tamei Tumas Medris. Now, both remember again, what's Tumas Medris? Remember we've learned this. Tumas Medris is when someone who's Tamei conveys Tuma to another item. How? By leaning on it. Right? By supporting his weight. See, even if halacha l'maisa, I'm not necessarily going ahead and touching it, but halacha l'maisa, if I'm supporting my weight against it, that becomes tumas medris as well. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Tmei medris, imatinok zav. For example, let's say the child becomes a zav. Nasis ha'agala av hatoma. The wagon itself could become an av hatoma. Demiyuchedes liyeshiva, because it is set aside ultimately for sitting on it. Da ha somich katan Allah nimtze shim yuchades lo. Yuchades lo the yeshiva vein omrim lo amod v'nasa malachto the ilulom yachto. Fine. So the point over here is that since this is a utensil that is set aside to support the weight or to sit on, if the child becomes a zav, halacha l'maisa, the agala, the wagon, becomes tamei as well. V'niteles b'Shabbos, but you can go ahead and take this wagon on Shabbos. In other words, the wagon's not muktzah. Why is the wagon not muktzah? Rashi says because it has the status of a kli. So it's not muktzah. Ve'eno nigreres ela al gabe kelim. Interestingly enough, you could only go ahead, you can't drag it over dirt. When it says it's only dragged over kelim, means you can't drag it over dirt. Right? We'll say, why not? Because the assumption is, what does a wagon do when you pull it over dirt? It makes a furrow. And remember again, making a furrow ultimately is going to be asr because of choresh. Rashi says plow. I'm sorry? Oh, good. We'll get to that. Right? So the answer is psikresha. Right? So I'll say, says the Gemara. So therefore, you could only pull the wagon, but it's got to be, it says on top of clothing. What it means just is you can only pull it on a hard surface. You can't pull it on dirt. The Edis of the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kala Kelim Inigrorin, Chutz Min Agala, Bipnei Shikovesh. Rabbi Yehuda says, in general, I agree with you, that on Shabbos, you can't go ahead and pull a utensil that is going to make a furrow. Because I will say, making a furrow on Shabbos, ultimately, again, is what? Is the malacha of choresh, the malacha of plowing. He says a wagon is permitted. This is fascinating. Why? Because a wagon doesn't make a furrow. What does a wagon make? A depression. So I will see, interestingly enough, what he says is, there's a chilik, right? A furrow, right? See, this is the difference between pulling a chair and pulling a wagon. A wheel will depress the dirt, right? The leg of a chair ultimately will uproot the dirt. The malach of charisha is not making a depression, right? The malach of charisha is uprooting dirt. Fascinating distinction. Says the Gemara, Agala shal katan tamei medris. So the wagon of a child is tamei tumas medris. Why? Das samech iluya, because the katan leans his weight on it. So if the katan is a zav, and the wagon is something that is used to support the weight of a person, it can become tamei tumas medris. V'nitelis b'Shabbos mishum de'ikataras kli ala. But yet you can move it on Shabbos. Why? Because the wagon has the status of a kli. Ve'eno nigreres ela agabe kelim. So as according to the first opinion in the Mishnah, you can move the wagon, but you can't move the wagon on a dirt surface. You can only move the wagon on we'll call it on top of clothing, but it means on a hard surface. Why? So the Gemara says, Al gabe kelim in, al gabe karka lo. On top of clothing, yes, but on top of earth, no. My time, what's the reason? Dika avid charetz. Ultimately, again, because halacha lamaisi, you are making a furrow, and the act of making a furrow on Shabbos is the malacha of choresh. Says the Gemara, money. Whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Hudahi the Amar Davar She'eno Miskavin Aser. So, what's the name? We said Machlokes Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shimon. This must reflect the view of Rabbi Huda, who holds that a davar she'eino miskavin is aser, because remember, halacha l'maisa, I don't have intention to make a furrow. That's not my intention. My intention is just to pull the wagon. But obviously, Rabbi Huda holds that halacha l'maisa, even though it's a davar she'eino miskavin, it is still going to be aser. Di'i Rabbi Shimon, because if it was reflective of the view of Rabbi Shimon, after all, ha'amar davar she'eino miskavin muter. Rabbi Shimon holds that a davar she'eino miskavin is muter. This now Rabbi Shimon Omer, Gorer Adam Mita. This is where the machlokes comes up. Dam Rabbi Shimon Gorer Adam Mita Ki Sevis Safsol Ubilvad Shleis Kavin Lasos Choritz. Because Rabbi Shimon holds that on Shabbos a person could drag a bed, a chair, a bench, even if you may end up making a furrow. Why? Because that's not your kavanah, and a davar she'eino miskavin is going to be muter. Ema Seifa Rabbi Huda Omer. Eina kol nigrarin b'Shabbos chutz min ha'agala mipnei shehi koveshes. Yeah, look at the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Huda says that you can't go ahead. You can't drag any utensil except for a wagon. Why? Because the wagon makes a depression. Mipnei shehi koveshes in aval charetz lo. They will say, interestingly enough, if it makes a depression, that's okay. But lamaiseh, for it to make a charetz, you couldn't do that. To which the Gemara is lo avda. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Trei tanoi va'ali b'd Rabbi Huda. There are two tanoim. There's machlokes tanoim in the position of Rabbi Huda. We'll say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Tanoi va'ali b'd Rabbi Huda. Chad savar ha'agala nami kishar kelim da'ose charetz b'gri rasa. So we'll say there is a machlokes in the position of Rabbi Huda. One Tana holds that halacha l'maisa, the wagon is just like any other kli. We view what the wheels of the wagon do as a charetz, right? As a furrow. And therefore again, halacha l'maisa b'girasa shepamim she'ena ofen miskalgel v'onigra. Because interestingly enough, even with the wagon, sometimes if the wheels are a little bit rickety or not put on the right way, when they move, they might not roll, but they might what? Drag. The difference between rolling and dragging is that ultimately, again, rolling will make a depression. Dragging could go ahead and make a charetz. The idach, so therefore, one version of Rabbi Huda will say that even the movement of the wagon will be problematic. The idach, the other opinion says, savar lo shchiach, that's not the norm. Ve'ena ela koveshes tachas kilgula. And halacha l'maisa, you're allowed to roll the wagon because the act of rolling the wagon creates depressions and not furrow. So we'll say, so again, halacha l'maisa, we know that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon, that a davar she'eino miskavin ultimately again is going to be mutter on Shabbos. The only exception to that rule, halacha l'maisa, is a psik reisha. Remember, davar she'eino miskavin means there might even be a high probability that the particular event may occur, but it's not definite. If ultimately, again, it's definitive, like, if, for example, if the only way to drag a chair from point A to point B is definitely you're going to make a charetz, you can't do it. Even Rabbi Shimon would agree that halacha l'maisa, you can't do it. But if there's a strong probability, but not a definitive reality, Then halacha l'maisa we pass in a psik reisha. I'm sorry, a davar she'eino miskamin is going to be mutter, but we try to avoid a psik reisha. Bosai hadrin aloch yamtiv mazel tov. By the way, incredible. Hadrin aloch yamtiv. Right, they will say, right, when first day chalamayid. What incredible is this? Hadrin aloch yamtiv. Baruch Hashem. Here we have to say we're saying goodbye to Perek Yom Tiv. But Baruch Hashem, we still have Yom Tiv. It's still chalamayid. It's a hadrin aloch Perek Yom Tiv. But Baruch Hashem, Yom Tov is still upon us. Tomorrow we'll say we begin an incredible sugya also on Hilchos Yom Tov, which malachas are permitted under the license of Ochel Nefesh and which are not. Tomorrow sugya Mirz Hashem. Shkoyach. Thank you for the beautiful wine. I tried to have a little restraint and wait a little bit. Couldn't. First night Yantiv was mamish like. So thank you. Baruch Hashem. Just like a little Isaac's ram is exactly what was needed. Perfect. Maybe gonna be around Sunday. Sunday. When's Erev Yantiv? Monday. Mirz Hashem. Thank you. Good night. Gavai, how are we doing? Yeah, or you could have.
Check for tzedakah.
Yes. Yep.
What about a check for work?
If it's a davar of like suckers never. That's my sense. Amen.